What then is the role of the IMF? It seems to me that the taxpayers' money goes to the IMF, they give it to the third world country, which in turn turns it back over to the banks. It looks like a
lot of it just goes directly from the taxpayers directed to the bank. It never goes to the third world. It's all by computer. But that was a few years back. I guess it was '83. There was an IMF bailout. They were in financial trouble, and it was $9 billion. Most of that money was necessary to pay interest, just to the big banks. That's why the Panama Canal Treaty existed. It was a banking deal too. It was Panama was having trouble making their payments to the banks, and they needed a better cash flow. The Canal Treaty occurred. They had more income. Now their little old Noriega isn't quite so obedient, and they're a little bit annoyed by it all. But Trujillo's and then Noriega were really the hand-picked people from our business banking industry. They had a banking haven down there, but now Noriega isn't quite so obedient. It's making the bankers a little nervous. They'd like to get rid of him, and so far they haven't been able to. And I think one of the reasons is he has a lot of information that he is threatened with. And they said, if you ever get too close to us, we're going to let the world know exactly how you've been dealing with us and subsidizing our drug trade. So I think he's doing a little blackmailing.
People who've studied the drug trade say that if were it not for the collusion and facilitation and laundering of money by the big banks, the drug trade wouldn't be able to operate.
They'd have a great deal of difficulty because they literally end up buying some of these banks, and they own the banks, and they do filter their money through. Now there's a great pretense that there's going to be a lot of crackdown on all these drug dealers and this money coming into that, and they're going to find out who it is. But I think that's basically designed to use as an excuse, develop this hysteria against drugs so that they have currency controls on whom? On American citizens who finally wise up and say, hey, I can't preserve my wealth in this country. I'm going to put a couple Krugerrands over in the Swiss banks. So they try to take everybody, when near the time of runaway inflation, people want to take the money out of the country to preserve their wealth. And that's why they're writing all these laws not to catch the drug dealers. I think that's just a front. I think the real reason is to have currency controls on the American citizens, because once a large number of citizens decide to leave, just think of how many people in Mexico tried to come here when their banking crisis occurred. The government clamped down. You can't take money out. They still did. But we had those, we had credit controls in the 1970s, currency controls, trying to keep people. Britain had them on, off and on, and they always resort to those kind of things. So we can anticipate it, but I think that's one of the purposes of the big drug issue, is order to write these laws so that they control innocent American people who would like to preserve their wealth.
But they could do away with the dope trade pretty fast if they really clamp down on the big banks, but they're the head people in the power structure.
That's right, but they're not likely to do that.
John, you've taken a look at foreign investment in the United States. Some of those statistics, haven't you?
It's startling when you look at it all in one lump sum. Ron, you're from Houston, and there was a story recently about Houston, prime real estate there being about 36% foreign-owned. That occurred in USA Today, a front-page story. Prime real estate in Los Angeles, 49%, 46%, something like that, foreign-owned. We're seeing investments every day, banks being bought, commercial properties, farmland. And the article that I saw, there was a study released last month on it, that the foreign investment total in the United States now is in excess of $1.3 trillion and growing at a tremendous rate. We call it the liquidation sale of America. Why is it happening?
There are several reasons why it's happening, but I think a lot of those investments are made by Japanese investors. I think it's rather interesting to note that we had to fight a war not too many years ago with Japan. We thought we won the war, and now they own not only a lot of Houston and Los Angeles, they own Waikiki Beach. They won due to our bad policy what they couldn't win in war. The main reason is it's our sick currency. We have a balance of trade problem, but we compound it by literally exporting a lot of our money through foreign aid and military aid. So even Japan gets a benefit of about $50 billion a year by us paying for all their national defense. So we sort of subsidize them, and because we're less competitive and our interest rates are high. Our interest rates 8 and 9%. In Japan, they're 2 and 3%. Labor costs are lower, so we can't compete anymore, and that's why we keep buying Japanese products. A lot of people say, well, the only solution is to write a law and say that Americans can't buy a Japanese car and no foreign investors allowed to invest in this country. We as libertarians don't accept that. It's treating the symptom rather than the disease. The disease is a foreign policy where we subsidize these rich allies. At the same time, we have a currency that's weak and we have economic conditions that have made us non-competitive. We don't want to take away the right of the individual to buy whatever product he wants, and we don't want to start some type of walling off of our country and saying nobody can come and go and people can't come in. I want a right to go out of the country and invest, and that means we have to allow somebody else to come in here and invest. So our solution is free markets, sound money, low interest rates, competitiveness, free market prices in labor, quit subsidizing Japan, a different foreign policy. Then I don't think we'd have to worry. We never had to worry about the foreigners buying up this country until recent times, until we got into these economic problems.
But it's curious, people who say we shouldn't keep financing the defense of Western Europe and Japan, and yet it's those people who are buying American securities and financing our deficit. So they are
foreigners?
Yeah, so they are indirectly paying for their own defense.
You know, there's some truth to that, and I think there's been a deal too. I think that sometimes they're buying our debt when it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but you have to think about again of this internationalism. They do this in order to maintain their order for their benefit. So even if it isn't to Japan's central bank's interest, you know, to buy our securities for a strict economic, they might be able to buy somebody else's security and make more money. They might be able to buy a Swiss security. It might be a better deal. But if it's best for order in their eyes, I think yes, they will. And indirectly, that is the case. So I think long term, we can't pay this debt. So if we owe Japan $1 trillion, if they bought $1 trillion worth of our treasury bills, I think they're going to be left holding the bag. And that's when I think the panic's going to come. When it finally dawns on them that they're holding a lot of lousy debt and they quit buying our debt, that'll be the precipitating event for the crisis. And that's when then the cartel, you know, this is a cartel of central banks, and they're working pretty well together, and there's a lot of power there. But I think they'll finally break up their little cartel, and they'll get a little bit antsy, and they won't buy our debt, and then the panic will start.
Isn't there a potential problem with the buying up of so much U.S. industry and banks and land? And that is, it's with ownership comes control and power. So are we, through letting them do this, actually giving the Japanese more and more power over our economic and political system?
That's why we should change our policy. That's why we should have sound money. I think it's very dangerous because we literally will lose control. And that's why I think it's urgent that we look to balancing a budget as quickly as possible and restoring sound money and changing our foreign policy. But if we're concerned, which I think everybody is, I don't think anybody is unconcerned. I think some people come up with different solutions, but I want to not deal with it in the narrow sense or probably writing some little rigid rule and say, well, I can solve this if we just keep Japan's cars out of here. We're going to solve our problem. It's not that easy. I mean, we have to look at the big picture of the economy, the monetary system, the deficits, the whole thing put together in order to solve it. It means it's not easy.
Well, thank you for sharing your time with us.
Thank you.
And your background and insight. And we all got to look for some place to go when that big crash occurs. I don't know where it's going to be, but
we got to prepare ourselves.
Maybe we all got to start studying Japanese.
Hopefully not.